This video accompanies a special topics and finishing article in the fall 2019 issue of Cast On that discusses making a mitten thumb joint a little neater. And you can see I haven't worked a whole mitten because the mitten I actually work for the project is on smaller needles and finer thread, finer yarn, and it's just kind of hard to see. So I worked up enough of a mitten, sort of a thumb gusset, joined the two. Now there are a couple of things that can make a mitten look awful, and if you're interested, you can look in the magazine where I will have a photo of what happens if you don't make a nice looking thumb gusset, what it looks like, not gusset, thumb pickup, and you can check that out. And the video, if you look, has a link to the magazine where you can look it up if you're a member. So the first thing that you can do to make it ugly is when you're working the hand and the gusset is finished, you're told to put these stitches on waste yarn. Most mitten patterns have you do that. And then it tells you to cast on 2 stitches over to bridge the gap between the 2 sides. That's how most patterns are written. And so you cast on those 2 stitches. Now the first thing that can go wrong is if you cast on 2 stitches and you use an E-cast on, these 2 stitches are going to be absolutely ginormous, and there's going to be a lot of slack in here. It's going to be really ugly. So what I do is I do a very tight yarn over between this side and that side, and there's enough of yarn in that tight yarn over that you can create 2 stitches. And in fact, sometimes it pulls those stitches a little tight. You can see this is actually the row where those are. Now you can always go in later and make those stitches larger by just using a tapestry needle or a needle to shift some yarn around. And that's a trick for fixing tension issues. And I could spend more time doing that. Now the next step is I need to pick up 2 stitches, and if I pick up the stitches going this direction, I'm going to be working the thumb inside out, so I don't want to do that. I want to pick it up from the kind of the top of the hand. And what I want to make sure I do is anytime you pick up stitches, anywhere, anytime, any place, if you want them to look nice, you want to pick them up in the center of a stitch, because if I pick up a stitch here and I pick up a stitch here and I pick up a stitch here, it's going to continue those lines of stitches. If I pick them up here, it's going to pinch the next stitch together. So you want to pick up in the center of the stitch, not between stitches. That's between a stitch right there, because it will pinch those together and you get dread 11s and it looks awful. So the first step is to get my working yarn, which I'm going to do, and I'm going to insert it through the thumb and pull it through. Now, I always leave a very long tail for this, because you can use it if things go wrong and don't look so great. You can use it to clean up the thumb, particularly if you're working in a dark color. If you're working in a light color like this one, you're going to see the problems. So I'm going to pick up 3 stitches. Now, I've done other videos on this, particularly for a hand one where I've picked up 4 stitches, but I was working in a dark colored yarn, and so I would pick up a stitch here. But in a light colored yarn, I use a different technique because it's a light colored yarn and you can see things better. And again, doing this is a pain in the butt because you've got a small little opening here, and I got all these needles, and it doesn't matter whether you're using double points or you're using magic loop, it's just going to be not fun. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up the stitches, and getting it started is always going to be fun, so have patience with me. I'm going to insert in my first column of stitches that I can see, and that's right there. Now you may ask, why do I have 3 stitches when I cast on or made 2 stitches? Well, we're looking at this upside down, and so it actually is between the stitches. It's the same as picking up stitches on a cast-on edge anytime. But you always want to go with the direction I'm looking at. That's where I'm going to be picking up the stitches so that they're going to continue on. So I got 3. 1, 2, 3. And in the other method, I would have picked them up in those 3 spots, but because I don't have a full stitch over here, I might just kind of wing it and pick up a stitch where I can. Again, I only do that if I've got dark yarns. Now for the first row, after I've picked up the stitches, I'm going to work the rest of the stitches on the thumb. And notice that I'm going to have an issue here. This is another area where it looks awful. I've got my stitches I've picked up on the inside, and then I've got the stitches on the thumb on the gusset, and notice there's just a colossal space in between here. That's just really awful. Well, I'll show you how I close that up on the next round. So I'm going to work those stitches, and the reason why I'm knitting so clumsily is in order to do the video, my hands are about maybe 1.5 feet away from where I normally knit, so it kind of feels like I'm knitting with my feet, but I'm suffering so that you can see what I'm doing. Okay, I'm almost there. Now, in the method that I use when I'm doing light colored yarns, and actually you can use it in dark colored yarns too, I'm being kind of snarky about that, is I work up until the fingers on the thumb until I get to the join. All right, now again, I've got that issue where I've got this gaping hole. And if I go ahead and just work it, there's going to be a gigantic hole there. And yes, I can use my yarn tail to clean it up, but it's never going to look quite perfect. So what I've discovered is that when I've had those stitches on the waste yarn, I wind up with a huge horizontal bar or line from the stitch where I first put in the waste yarn. It just gets larger and larger. And so what I discovered I can do is that if I create a stitch, oops, I wanted to go the other way around. If I create a stitch out of that, like you would an M1, that's exactly what I'm doing here, is I'm creating an M1. Instead of picking up a stitch, I'm creating an M1. So if I go ahead and I create an M1 out of that, what I want to do is I want to close up these 2 sides, and I can do that by knitting this. This is my first stitch, and you can tell because if I pull on my yarn tail, it gets smaller, by knitting those 2 guys together. So I'm going to knit them together, and initially they're going to look really big and sloppy because that's my yarn tail, and if I pull on it, I can make it smaller. Then I'm going to knit the next stitch. Remember, I cast on 3, so I've done 1 and 2. And then I've got this stitch over here. Zoop. And what I can do is, it's an actual stitch because I picked it up, is I can knit it together with the first stitch on the stitches that were part of the thumb gusset, not the stitches I created. Okay, so I'm going to go through and do that. And so I have picked up all my stitches, and I'm just going to work a couple of rounds so you can see what this looks like. Again, knitting a thumb, or fingers for that matter. For that articles on gloves, I did 3 pairs of gloves, and let me tell you, I was mightily weary of fingers by that time. And so I'm just going to go through here. Now, one of the things that can make this look kind of sloppy, the thumb join sloppy, is you wind up with oversized stitches in there. And, oops, split the stitch. Again, I'm knitting at an angle that's not all that comfortable for me. You can always go through with your tapestry needle and shift yarn around to make it look nice. That is not cheating. That is part of finishing. Okay, just 1 or 2 more of these, and we should have it. I'll go over 1 more. Now, what you want this thing to look like when you're done is you want to have the stitches line up from the stitches that you picked up with the stitches of the thumb and the hand. And there's actually a name for that. I can't remember what it is, but I was looking up, doing some research, and I thought, well, that's handy. For the stitches inside the finger of a glove and the outside stitches, it's a little more detail than I need to know, but anyway. And you want the stitches on the hand to not be disrupted. And if you've picked up those stitches in such a way or worked the thumb gusset in such a way that those are disrupted, that's not going to work. Well, I've got enough of this that I think we can take a look at it now. Now notice that this is my yarn tail, and if I pull it through this way, so this is the one that I worked first, where I lifted and did the M1. And notice that's a pretty clean look. I do have a little bit of a peek through in there of that M1 I created, but if I wanted to, I could go in and I could fix that by tightening up those 2 stitches, but really that doesn't bother me that much. But the important thing is, notice this nice long line of stitches right here. The stitch pattern is continued. Now again, it's a little bumpy there because of the increases for the gusset, but that's not bad looking. And notice that the stitch patterns continue there from that one. Now let's look at the other side. This is the side where I knit the 2 together, and it's the same thing. There's a little bit of a punch in there, but I could, if I wanted to, with the yarn tail, go in and close that up, although I think it looks fine this way. But this line of stitches continues. And then let's look on the inside of the pickup and notice that the stitches from the 2 stitches that I picked up continue on in the center of the glove, of the thumb. So that's pretty neat. Now again, there's lots of ways to do this, but the goal is that it looks neat and that the stitches in here are continued, the patterns on either side, and if you can think of a better way to do it or some other slight variation, that is just fine. The thing I like about this method is you really don't need to do much besides just pull that stitch in and then weave in your yarn tail. I mean, that thumb is pretty much good to go.